Hey, welcome and please join my Patreon with best exclusive content there. So today we are gonna see what if young Naruto and Zabuza build secret harem with teneten. 10-year-old Naruto ran down the street with a bucket of paint in each hand, and a big grin plastered on his face. This makes my 13th prank in the last 4 days, he thought to himself, and I have a feeling this would be the best one yet. He had spent a whole hour planning this one. He would paint a message onto the 4th Hokage's face saying that Suna was going to attack the village, then everyone was running around getting ready for the supposed invasion. He would throw kunai off the top of the buildings. Well, that was his plan, except it had now been 45 minutes since he had painted the message and at least 50 people had looked at the message, half of them shinobi, and there was no frenzy. Naruto was no genius, but even he knew something was wrong. Why is everyone so calm? Naruto thought. Meanwhile, Hiruzen Sarutobi, the current Hokage, was watching the young blonde write the message. Painting the Hokage's face is one thing, but telling everyone in the village that Suna is going to attack. He's crossed the line, he thought as rage filled him, rage he hadn't felt in years. He made a cross with his fingers and created a single shadow clone. You know what to do, he said to the clone as he got up, and the clone sat down and started to do paperwork. Hiruzen appeared behind Naruto, who was sitting on top of the Hokage monuments. When Naruto felt someone behind him, he turned around and saw his Gigi and smiled, then said, "Hey Gigi, how do you like my prank? It's awesome, right?" Naruto waited for an answer with a happy expression on his face, which changed to worry when he realized that his Gigi was glaring at him. The Hokage couldn't contain his rage any longer and shouted at the blonde, saying, "You've crossed the line, Naruto. How dare you write something like that? You keep saying that you'll be Hokage one day, but you will never ever be Hokage if all you do is pull pranks, and until you start taking the role of ninja seriously, you will never be Hokage." By the end of long-winded speech, Naruto was in shock and tears silently fell down his face. He's right, I'll never be Hokage if I keep acting like this, but no one at the academy teaches me anything. What should I do? Naruto thought as he started to back away from the Hokage, then turned around ran. Sarutobi watched the young blonde run away from his and thought, what have I done? Naruto ran and ran. He didn't even know where he was going, but he didn't want to stop. He was barely aware that he was now leaving the village and entering the surrounding forest. No one at the academy teaches me anything, so how can I learn how to be a ninja? I need a teacher, someone who will make me strong, Naruto thought. Naruto didn't know how long he had been running, but his legs were getting tired, so he stopped at a small clearing. It was now nightfall and Naruto fell to the ground panting. Knowing that if he didn't find someone to teach him he would never become a ninja, Naruto made a desperate plea to the heavens and yelled, "Please, I need a teacher." Meanwhile, in the forest a little more than a mile from Konoha's walls, a man sat leaning against a boulder. He was tired of having to avoid Hunter Ninja, red of not getting to sleep in a warm bed. But alas, this was the life of a rogue ninja, but still he wished he could live in a village with people. His dream was once to rule Kiri, but now all he wanted was those Hunter Ninja to stop chasing him. The man wore no shirt, instead he wore camouflage wristbands that extended all the way to his elbows, and his face was covered in white bandages from his nose down. His pants were light blue. And he had the same camouflage bands that were on his forearms but went from his knees to his ankles. Finally, he wore shinobi sandals and had a huge balda next to him. He was about to close his eyes and rest for a bit when he heard someone yell, "I need a teacher," and he immediately tensed. Then after a minute and nothing happened, he decided to check it out. He picked up his abnormally large blade and stealthily walked in the direction of the voice. When he got there, his jaw dropped. In the middle of a small clearing lay a boy no older than 10, the only catch was he was the spitting image of Konoha's 4th Hokage. What's a kid doing in the forest at this time of night? The man thought, as he was debating what to do. After a minute he decided, and he walked out into the clearing. By now the boy had noticed that he was not alone anymore, and stood up and looked at the man with scared eyes. The man grunted, "Coward," then quickly said, "It's okay, I'm not going to hurt you." The blonde kid relaxed a little, so the man continued, "Why do you teach a teacher?" At this the blonde's face saddened, and then he said, "I need to become a powerful ninja so that I can fulfill my dream." The man looked at the blonde with piercing eyes, then said, "I see, so what is your dream?" At this the boy gave a small smile, looked the man straight in the eye with a fierce determination and said, "My dream is to become the greatest Hokage." The man's eyes widened and slowly an idea began to form in his mind. After a minute to work out the flaws in the plan he had finished it. He looked at the boy then said, "Boy, what is your name?" The blonde looked at the man and gave a wide grin. "My name is Naruto Uzumaki." The man looked at Naruto then said, "Okay Naruto, I'll make you a deal. I will train you to become a powerful ninja if when you become Hokage you promise to take me in as a Konoha shinobi." The man looked at Naruto who was looking into the sky obviously thinking. And after a minute Naruto looked back at the man and said, "It's a deal." The man nodded and said, "Good, but there are some very important rules that you have to follow." Naruto tilted his head to the side. A sign of confusion, so the man elaborated. "First off, you must never tell anyone about me or your training." Naruto nodded with a determined look on his face, obviously wanting to impress his new sensei. The man continued, "Second, you are to meet me here every night after everyone in your village is asleep and make sure you are not followed." Naruto nodded again, so the man finished by saying, "And finally you are to act, talk, and fight like you didn't get any training from me until I give you the okay to show your new abilities." Naruto nodded one last time and once again trying to impress his sensei by being polite said, "Please forgive my rudeness sensei, but what is your name?" The man stared at Naruto then said, "You may call me Zabuza-sama." Naruto stood up straight then said, "Hi, Zabuza-sama." Zabuza smiled underneath his bandages then said, "So I take it you're in the academy." Naruto nodded, so Zabuza said, "Now Naruto, everything I teach you is important, you must remember that. That said, we will start with chakra control." So for the rest of the night, about 6.5 hours, Zabuza had Naruto climb trees without using his hand and instead applying the right amount of chakra to his feet. By the end of the night, two things had happened. One was that Naruto had managed to get 3/4 of the way up the tree. The second was that Zabuza was in shock. The entire time the boy had not stopped and wasn't even panting. "This kid easily has 5 to 6 times the amount of chakra I have, and he's just a kid." Zabuza then realized that the kid would have to be at the academy soon, so he got up and walked over to the boy. When he got to the boy he said, "Naruto, that's enough for tonight, you did well." Naruto smiled at Zabuza who was looking at him intently. After a moment Zabuza said, "After the academy, go and buy some different clothes, preferably black shinobi pants and sandals along with a shirt that's not orange." Naruto frowned at Zabuza but after seeing the look on his face said, "Okay, got it." Zabuza sighed then said, "Remember, only wear the new cloths with me." Naruto nodded then said, "Hi, Zabuza-sama," and ran off towards the village. Zabuza sighed as he watched the blonde run off. They decided to buy a shitload of kunai, shuriken, and ninja wire for the blonde, and with that he headed off as well. Since Naruto had about an hour until the academy started, he decided to get his new cloths before instead of after. And there was only one place in all of Konoha that sold what he needed and did not kick him out when he walked in the door. Naruto ran through the streets getting glares thrown at him left and right until he stopped at a store and walked in. "Hello, how can I help you?" the man at the register said, looking at Naruto. "Just browsing," Naruto said, and after 5 minutes, Naruto had picked out 4 pairs of all the cloths he needed and set them next to the register. The man looked at everything Naruto was buying then said, "That'll be 600 ryo please." Naruto nodded and put the money on the counter then frowned at the amount left in his wallet. As Naruto walked into his apartment he put the cloths in his closet, then took a shower. After the shower he got dressed in his normal orange outfit. Then he heard a knock on the door. When Naruto opened the door he saw the third Hokage standing on his doorstep who said, "Naruto, would you like to get some ramen?" Naruto Street. At the old man in front of him then stepped out of his apartment, closed the door and brushed past the Hokage not saying a word. The Hokage frowned then said, "Naruto, show some respect for your elders." Naruto looked back at the Hokage then said, "Respect is not given on a silver platter, it is earned," and with that Naruto was on his way. Class that day was boring as usual, but then a thought occurred to Naruto. If I'm going to be Hokage then I need to learn this stuff, even if it is boring. and so from that day on Naruto started to listen to the lectures and study for the tests, and soon days turned into weeks. And weeks turned into months, and after 8 months Naruto was becoming so skilled it frustrated him greatly that he had to hide his true strength when he sparred in the academy. Naruto's speed and strength were currently that of a Chunin thanks to this adjustable weights, along with his taijutsu tactical skill and style. His genjutsu was still academy level, and his ninjutsu was Chunin level. He had mastered the replacement jutsu, the shadow shuriken jutsu, and even the shadow clone jutsu. He even figured out that his elemental affinity was water thanks to chakra paper. And he had been using his shadow clones to speed up his mastery of the different water-style jutsu he knew. Zabuza had taught him the ninja art, hidden mist just you, the water style, violent water wave. And the water style, water dragon jutsu, which he had now mastered to the point where he could use water jutsus where there was no water. Naruto was laying in his bed with his hands behind his head. He was getting stronger all the time, once he even beat Zabuza in a taijutsu sparring match. His sensei always tried to beat Naruto as quick as possible because of his huge chakra reserves. He remembered Zabuza once saying, "With your huge chakra reserves and precise chakra control you'll be able to using far more jutsu than everyone else in one battle, that is one of your greatest strengths." Naruto turned his head to look at his clock and thought, well, time to train, as he slid out of bed and put on his training clothes. He attached his kunai holster to his right leg and put his shuriken holster on his right leg as well below the kunai holster. Then Naruto got out a scroll and released its contents, an Anbu katana that Zabuza had gave him. Once he was ready Naruto jumped out his window and landed like a cat on the ground, then began to silently run to his and Zabuza's training location. When Naruto got to the training spot he found Zabuza was standing in the center with some scrolls in one hand. Zabuza looked at Naruto then said, "We have some matters to discuss." Naruto nodded saying, "Hi, Zabuza-sama, what would you like to talk about?" Zabuza looked at Naruto intent why before saying, "First I know that you failed the test to become a genin on purpose to have more time to train with me, during your second try to pass the test in 1 month I order you to pass." Naruto stood tall and said, "Hi, Zabuza-sama." Zabuza nodded his approval then continued, "This leaves us 1 month to train you. In that 1 month you are to master 2A rank water jutsus, and then there is a surprise test once you do. And I think 100 shadow clones would be sufficient." Naruto nodded and said, "What are the 2 jutsus?" Zabuza looked Naruto in the eye and said, "Before I tell you there is one other thing. Once you're a genin you will go on missions and I won't help you anymore, so I took some scrolls from your village that contain water jutsu that the Nadaime Hokage used, you are to practice these by yourself." Naruto nodded then said, "Okay, but when do I get to show my true strength?" Zabuza looked into the sky for a moment then back at Naruto who was waiting patiently for an answer and said, "During the Chunin exams which I'm confident you'll make it too. But before those exams I want you to hide these scrolls somewhere outside of your house because once you show your true strength, people will be suspicious of you and the Hokage might search your house." Naruto sighed as he looked down then looked back up and said, "Okay fine, but anyway what are the 2 jutsu that I have to learn?" Naruto could tell that Zabuza was smirking and gulped. This meant it was going to be really hard work. After a moment Zabuza said, "First is an offensive one called water style, Grand Waterfall Jutsu. And the second is a defensive jutsu called Water Style, Water Wall Jutsu." Naruto smirked and asked, "I think I'll start with the Grand Waterfall Jutsu, so how is the jutsu done?" Zabuza showed Naruto the hand signs. And after 5 minutes Naruto could do the hand signs perfectly at top speeds. Once Zabuza saw this he said, "Watch me." Naruto did as he was told and when the jutsu was finished he realized that it was basically a giant water blast where the water is rotating at high speeds giving your opponent a large quantity of shallow gashes. Naruto turned back to the clearing and just as his sensei instructed summoned 100 shadow clones then said, "Alright guys, you know what to do." And with that all 100 of them began to practice, and Naruto and Zabuza moved far enough away so as not get hit by the powerful water jutsus. By the time it was morning Naruto had created and recreated over 6,000 clones and had now mastered the jutsu perfectly. Zabuza looked at Naruto in awe and thought, "He never ceases to amaze me." Mastering a jutsu like that at his age, it's unheard of, let alone in one night. Then he noticed Naruto fall off the tree he was standing on unconscious. Zabuza caught him and said, well. I guess even he runs out of chakra. And at that Zabuza stealthily brought Naruto into his village and to his apartment and placed him onto his bed. Man, this place is such a dump, Zabuza thought as he pitied the boy. Iruka stood in front of his class very frustrated, whereas Naruto, he thought, it was already third period and he hadn't shown up yet. To be honest, Iruka was getting worried. Even Naruto didn't skip class, not anymore anyway. Iruka looked back at his class and said, Mizuki, please take over the class for the time being, I'll be back in a bit. Mizuki nodded and with that Iruka walked out the door and then sprinted to Naruto's apartment. When Iruka made it to Naruto's apartment, he knocked on the door. No answer. I should go in just to be sure, he thought. So he opened the door and walked in only to find Naruto sleeping, and he was about to hit the blonde over the head when he noticed at least 20 shallow gashes along the boy's torso, back, and arms. Iruka lowered his arm and thought, he's been training, but what in the world could have given him those gashes? Well, I guess I'll let him sleep, he said quietly, and left. 3 weeks later, Naruto stood in front of Zabuza at their training grounds. Zabuza staring intently into Naruto's eyes as if to confirm something. After a moment he spoke, Naruto, not only did you master the 2 water jutsus I showed, you also mastered a jutsu even I couldn't. The water style, water shockwave jutsu. Zabuza paused, taking in Naruto's expression, which was pride in himself, then continued, now I have a surprise test for you. Naruto looked up at his sensei, attentively waiting for the test. You will be leaving Konoha for 1 week to hunt down and kill a rogue Chunin ninja, and you will bring me his head as proof, Zabuza ate, handing him a storage scroll which Naruto took. Naruto sighed and said, I guess I'll have to do it sooner or later, but people will notice that I'm gone. Zabuza chuckled then said, that is why I will be posing as you until you get back. Naruto nodded as Zabuza gave him the description and location of the rogue ninja, and already having everything he needed, he set off in search on the missing ninja. It had been 3 days since Naruto left and he had found his target. The man was about 22 and wore an standard Kiri Chunin outfit. He had his kunai holster on the thigh of his left leg. Naruto looked at the man. Now's the time to strike, he thought as he threw 6 shuriken at the man. Just as the shuriken were about to hit their mark, the man whipped around and deflected them with a kunai, onl. Y to be pooched in the gut and then kicked in the jaw, sending him flying into the air. The man landed on his feet and turned to look at his attacker, then started to laugh. He's just a kid, but stopped laughing when a very thick mist covered the area and he heard the kid say, ninja art, hidden mist jutsu. The man smirked. The kid just gave me his position by saying his jutsu. Suddenly he heard the whizzing sound of a kunai slicing through air coming from the direction of the kid. Kid's just a rookie, he didn't even move, he thought as he deflected the kunai with one of his own. The man's eyes widened when cold steel against his neck, and suddenly the mist disappeared, revealing the kid in front of him bursting into smoke. A shadow clone, he thought, but that was his last thought as his head was chopped off and sealed into a storage scroll. Well, time to head back home, and with that he headed back to his village. Little did he know he would be having nightmares all the way back about his first kill. Later in the week, back at Konoha, Zabuza transformed as Naruto was walking down the street back to his temporary apartment while receiving glares left and right. All the time fighting the urge to kill every last one of the villagers. So this is what Naruto must go through. How can he stand it? We figured out he had the Kyuubi sealed within him, but that probably made things worse for him, Zabuza thought. Well, it doesn't matter, he'll be back tonight, he said. But a voice behind him said, who's gonna be back tonight? This made him stop and he turned around to see a guy he recognized as Konoha's taijutsu master Might Guy. Zabuza looked at the man as calmly as he could and said, oh, I was just reciting a line in a book I read. That was the lamest excuse ever. Guy looked at him and said, very youthful my friend, what was the book's name anyhow? By now Zabuza was starting to sweat and without thinking said, 1,000,000 Ways to Fool an Idiot. Guy looked at him for moment, then started to laugh and said, very youthful indeed my friend, and with that he sped off in a direction unknown, for he was too fast for Zabuza to see. Zabuza sighed and continued to walk to his temporary apartment. When he got there he took a shower and then went to bed early. Zabuza woke up at midnight and headed to his and Naruto's training spot. If he's still alive then he'll be back by now, he thought. When he got there he saw Naruto sitting on a tree and quickly noticed the bags under his eyes. Zabuza undid the transformation and returned to his old self, then looked up at Naruto and said, "You're having nightmares of your first kill, aren't you?" Naruto just threw down the scroll in response, which Zabuza opened and unsealed its contents, revealing the head of the man Naruto was sent to kill. Zabuza sighed and said, "Naruto, come here for a moment," and Naruto obliged and jumped off the tree and landed next to his sensei. Zabuza put his hands on Naruto's shoulders like a father old and said, "Naruto, this is the life of a shinobi, but think of it like this: we do not just kill for fun, we kill to protect our villages. That ninja you killed could have become a threat to your village one day." Naruto looked into Zabuza's eyes and said, "Yeah, that does make sense, thanks Zabuza," ending the sentence with a genuine smile on his face. Zabuza's face turned serious and he said, "Naruto. Oh, this is the last time we will see each other for a while. When the time is right I will contact you and you will know that it's me, and here are the scrolls and make sure that you hide them good." As he finished he handed Naruto the scrolls, who accepted them. Zabuza looked at the blonde one last time and said, "And make sure you pass the test to become a genin, got it?" Naruto nodded, gave one last wave. He then walked off, ready for the life of a ninja. Zabuza watched his apprentice walk away and for the first time in a long time he let a teardrop slide down his face. He felt he was happiest person alive. Naruto walked down the street with his teammates Sakura Haruno and Sasuke Uchiha along with their sensei Kakashi Hatake. He had graduated from the academy on his second try with flying colors. Since then a lot of things had happened. They had completed 84D rank, 2C rank, and even 1A rank mission that had gone bad, and they had a run-in with Kisame Hoshigaki which they barely got out of. In reality, Naruto's ninjutsu and taijutsu was Jonin level. His genjutsu was somewhere between academy and genin levels since he only knew how to dispel chunin level genjutsus. Now a 12-year-old Naruto had to act like he was just good enough to get into the chunin exams, which they were just informed that they were attending. Naruto looked over at Sakura, who hadn't really improved since the academy, and in reality was just a burden to the team. Sasuke on the other hand had become much stronger and had 2 tomo in each eye now. Naruto looked at his teammates and said, "Well, I'll see you guys tomorrow. And make sure that you're ready for tomorrow." Sasuke gave him a sideways glance and said, "Whatever, Dobi," and with that he disappeared and Sakura left as well, and without a word. On Naruto's way home he thought he recognized a tall man with long white spiky hair from a book he read, but brushed off the thought. When Naruto got to his house he did his daily workout of 100 push-ups, 200 sit-ups, and then started his beginner taijutsu forms, but then stopped and thought, if tomorrow I'm going to start showing everyone my from strength I'll have to practice my advanced forms. And with that he started going through a complex series of taijutsu forms, slowly speeding up his movements until he was moving at a very fast pace. By the time he was done Naruto was sweating heavily, and said, "That's enough for today. I think I'll take a shower." When Naruto was done with his shower he decided to go to Ichiraku's, so he put on his orange jumpsuit and was about to head out when he thought, "I guess there's no harm in starting to wear those clothes tonight." And so Naruto switched into his new shinobi outfit. He now wore a long-sleeve red shirt with a storm gray short-sleeve shirt over it, and black shinbi pants and sandals. Finally he attached his kunai holster to his left leg, but decided not to wear his anbu blade, thinking it might be suspicious. When Naruto got to Ichiraku's he noticed that someone new was sitting at the restaurant eating a bowl of ramen. So Naruto sat down next to the girl who he realized was about his age, and looked over at her. "Wow, she's beautiful," Naruto thought. Then Naruto realized that he was staring at her and now she was staring back. "Hey, why are you staring at me?" the girl asked. Naruto blushed and said, "Oh, I'm sorry," and turned away. The girl blushed then went back to eating. Just then Ayame appeared and said, "So Naruto, what will it be today?" Naruto grinned and said, "1 miso pork ramen please." Ayame nodded and said, "Coming right up," and walked away. Naruto looked back at the girl and said, So what's your name? The girl looked at him and said, the name's Teneten, what's yours? Naruto gave a wide grin and said, Naruto Uzumaki. Ten nodded and then narrowed her eyes and said, you wouldn't happen to be entered in the Chunin exams, would you? Naruto frowned and said, yeah I am. Wait, don't tell me you're entered as well. Teneten no. Deed, and they both ate their meals in silence. Once Naruto was finished he left without saying another word. That night Naruto couldn't sleep, all he could think about was Teneten and how beautiful she was. When he finally fell asleep it would be the first time in months he was haunted by his first kill. When Naruto awoke he thought, this is the day I show my true strength, and he put on his new shinobi outfit and attached his kunai and shuriken holsters to his right leg. When he was ready he set out for the location of the first part of the Chunin exams. While Naruto was walking down the street, people were looking at him confused. Naruto just continued to stare ahead, and thought, wait until they see me fight. When Naruto made it to the building he saw that Sakura and Sasuke were already there waiting. When Naruto reached his teammates both of them thought, looks like Naruto ditched the orange jumpsuit. Sakura smiled and said, hey Naruto, good choice of clothing, and Sasuke just nodded his approval. Naruto just walked past them and said, yeah whatever, let's go, causing Sasuke and Sakura's eyes to widen with shock. Naruto knew he had just been very rude to his teammate, but also knew that he needed to be serious for the exams. That meant no jokes and no fooling around. Naruto and the others were on their way to the location of the first exam when out of nowhere a kid with the biggest bushy eyebrows landed 10 feet in front of them. The kid looked the three of them other and stopped at Sasuke then said, you, fight me. Sasuke looked at the kid with disgust and said, you the hell are you? The kid looked at him and said, my name is Rock Lee, and with that he got into an awkward battle stance. Lee's battle stance had Sasuke and Sakura confused but Naruto knew the stance was used for people with extreme speed. Guess those weights paid off, I'll bet you I'm faster than he is, and Naruto stepped forward. Sasuke looked at Naruto stepping forward and said, what are you doing Naruto? Naruto just smirked and said, I get him first. Sasuke just shrugged and said, whatever, then Sasuke smiled. I can tell this guy's good, Naruto's gonna get whooped. Nah. Naruto just stared at Lee and then said, you ready, and Lee nodded. Naruto moved faster than Sasuke, Sakura, or Lee could see and in the blink of an eye Naruto landed a vicious punch to Lee's gut. Lee dropped to the ground unconscious and Naruto said, done. When Sasuke realized what had happened he thought, how is this possible, I couldn't even keep up with him. Sakura was just in shock and was thinking along the same lines as Sasuke. Then Sakura looked at the clock and realized that they only had 15 minutes to register 40 exams. Sakura looked at both her teammates and said, hey guys we got to hurry up and register. They both nodded and then Sasuke said, what should we do about that Lee kid? Naruto's answer to Sasuke's question surprised Sakura, just leave him, it means less competition. Sakura gulped and thought, is this really Naruto, when did he get so cold? And with that the three teammates left unknown to them an older man identical to Lee appeared to wake Lee up. Shortly after Naruto and his team registered, they arrived in a room full of people registered for the Chunin exams. Naruto looked over all the other contestants, after a quick analysis he concluded that the only two that could be a problem were a kid named Neji Hyuga, and some other guy with red hair. The kid with red hair had a look on his face that clearly said, I want to kill everyone in this room. Nah. Naruto looked over at the door when it opened and saw that Lee kid walking in, with an older exact copy of him walking behind him. Guy looked at the blonde-haired genin and frowned, I can't believe that kid is as fast as Lee. Wait, isn't he Kakashi's student? Lee walked over to his team while holding his stomach. Teneten gasped when she saw Lee and said, Lee, what happened to you? Lee looked up at Teneten, shame written all over his face and said, I lost in a fight. Teneten gave Lee a confused look and said, who did you fight? Lee pointed to a blonde shinobi near the other side of the room. When Teneten saw Naruto she gasped and thought, that's the kid from Ichiraku's, then turned to Lee and said, did you find out any of his abilities? Lee just shook his head and Teneten said, why not? Lee looked down and said, because he beat me with one punch. Tenten gasped again and thought, he's got to be good if he beat Lee in one punch. Just then the door opened again and a man with a black trench coat and a bandana covering his head appeared and said, "All right you wimps, my name is Ibiki Morino and I'll be your proctor for the first exam, now follow me," and he walked out of the room. When Genin got to the room they all noticed ninjas seated around the room, and soon after Ibiki handed out slips of paper with assigned seats on them. Once all the genin were seated, Ibiki's voice ran through out the room, "Alright, the first part of the exam is a written one. As you can see there are papers in front of you, each with 9 questions. Ibiki paused to let this sink in then continued, "Here are the rules. First, each question is worth 1 point. Second, no cheating is allowed and if you're caught cheating 2 points will be deducted from your school, and if you're caught cheating 3 times you automatically fail." Ibiki paused again then continued, "Third, you will be graded as a team, so if one of you fails then your whole team fails, and finally you have 45 minutes to complete the test and when you do I will give you the 10th question." Ibiki looked around the room to make sure that everyone was ready then said, "Begin," and with that everyone began the exam. Soon after the rookie 9 and so me of the others realized that the exam was meant to be cheated on, and so the cheating began. After 35 minutes Naruto successfully answered 5 out of the 9 questions without cheating and decided to cheat to get the rest of the answers. So Naruto quietly took out a kunai and used its reflection to see the answers of a kid in front of him who hadn't stopped writing since the start. Naruto had just got 10 the last answer when Ibiki said, "Alright, pencils down," and everyone obliged. Ibiki looked them over then said, "Alright, here's the 10th question, but before I give it to you there's a catch. If you get it right you automatically pass. But if you get it wrong you will be stuck a genin the rest of your life." At this Kiba said, "That's bull, you can't do that and I've seen plenty of people take the exam twice." Ibiki laughed then said, "That's because I wasn't the proctor then. Anyway, you all have the option of leaving and taking the exam next time, but be warned if you do your team forfeits as well." After Ibiki said that genin began to leave left and right taking their teams with them. Then when Ibiki saw that no more teams were forfeiting he thought, looks like this batch of runts has some backbone, there's more than usual." Then Ibiki smiled and said, "You all pass." Everyone's eyes widened and he elaborated, "To put it short and simple, this was a test to see how much backbone you all have, so once again you all pass." Right when Ibiki finished 4 kunai strapped to some cloth smashed through the window. The 4 kunai went in different directions revealing that the cloth said, "Enko Midarashi, proctor of the second exam," and a woman with purple hair, a tan trench coat on, and a fishnet skirt under it appeared from through the window. Enko looked around the room and then at Ibiki and frowned. "Ibiki, are you getting soft on me? Why did you pass so many kiddies?" Ibiki smirked and said, "Maybe they're just a better batch of runts this year." Enko grinned and said, "I'll be the judge of that. Now all you kiddies follow me to training ground 44 aka the Forest of Death." At that everyone regrouped with their teams and followed Enko to the Forest of Death. On the way to the train, in ground 44 Sasuke looked at Naruto and said, "Hey Dobi, how many of the 9 questions did you get?" Naruto just kept looking ahead and said, "I got all 9. Sasuke's eyes narrowed and he looked back ahead and said, "Whatever." When everyone was at the training ground Enko explained how each team had a heaven or earth scroll and had 5 days to find and take the scroll they didn't have from another team. By any means necessary and get to the tower in the center of the forest. Then she explained that if you open the scroll you automatically fail the exam, and so Enko handed out the papers to sign saying, that you agree to the risks of getting killed. Then when everyone had signed the papers they were all sent to their respective gates to await the start of the exam. Then all of a sudden a whistle sounded and all the gates opened. The second part of the exam had begun, and everyone raced into the forest. Naruto and his teammates raced through the forest, with Naruto holding their team's earth scroll. Naruto looked at Sasuke and was about to say something when a kunai with a paper bomb attached flew in front of him. Naruto, Sasuke, and Sakura leapt away from the kunai and hid behind trees. All 3 of them looked for their opponents. But none of them could spot anyone. They hide well, Sasuke and Sakura thought. Naruto coming up with a plan created a shadow clone and sent it into the clearing as bait. Sasuke and Sakura noticed Naruto moving out of the shadows and thought, "Shit, What is he thinking? But before either of them could move, two GRSS ninja appeared in front of Naruto. The first punched Naruto in the gut and the second kicked him in the side of the head. But what happened next surprised everyone. The shadow clone exploded, slamming the two grass ninja into trees and knocking them out. Just after this happened, the real Naruto walked out from behind the trees and said loudly, "Shadow clone explosion jutsu, success." Sakura just stared at Naruto in shock as he started to search for something in the unconscious ninja's clothes. Sasuke on the other hand was getting irritated. Where is he learning this stuff? He thought as he jumped down with Sakura to join Naruto. Aha, Found it, Naruto said as he pulled out a heaven scroll from the second ninja's pocket and showed it to his teammates. Naruto looked ahead and said, "Now we can head to the center and then move on to the third part of the exam." Sasuke made a mental note to ask Naruto how he learned that stuff later, then said, "Yeah, let's go." The rest of the trip was uneventful, and by the morning of the third day were basically at the center of the forest. That was when it happened. 3 Omegakure ninjas appeared before them. All of them wore tan body suits, with breath masks covering their mouths. The one in the middle stepped forward and then said, "Make this easy on yourselves and just hand over your heaven scroll." Naruto looked at the kid and said, "HN, fat chance." The one in the middle sighed, then thr. Eu a kunai at Naruto, which Sasuke blocked, hiding Naruto's hand sign for his shadow clone. The clone Naruto ran out from behind Sasuke, who was perfectly hiding the real Naruto's body with his own. The clone Naruto engaged the middle ninja in taijutsu, and it was immediately clear that Naruto's taijutsu style far outclassed the aim ninja. Soon the clone Naruto overwhelmed the ninja and sent him back in line with the others with a punch to the face. At this moment the real Naruto jumped into the air, revealing himself, threw a single shuriken at the middle ninja, did some hand signs and then said, "Shadow shuriken jutsu." And the single shuriken turned into 200 shuriken. The grass ninja immediately realized that the range of the shuriken barrage was so great that they wouldn't be able to dodge in time. So they each tried to deflect the shuriken, only for each to be impaled with at least 20 shuriken, killing them. Sasuke couldn't stand it anymore and said, "Naruto, how the hell did you learn all this?" Naruto, who had been expecting this, said, "Don't worry about it, Tem." And with that Naruto headed off to the building in the center of the forest, which was now visible, while Sasuke was glaring daggers at Naruto. When the trio stepped inside the building they noticed that only one other team had arrived, the team with the guy who had red hair. Naruto was about to ask what they were supposed to do when Sakura said, "Hey guys, this sign says we can open the scrolls now." Once hearing this, Naruto looked at his teammates, who both nodded, so he opened both scrolls. Right when both scrolls reopened, Kakashi, their one and only sensei, appeared in a puff of smoke. Kakashi looked at his 3 students and said, "Good job, but you now must wait here for the remaining 2 days, then you will be summoned to the next exam." All 3 genin nodded and Kakashi disappeared in another puff of smoke. The remaining 2 days were boring to say the least, since practicing was allowed and they weren't allowed outside. But by the time the 2 days were up, everyone who made it before the 5th day was well rested. Now the remaining candidates stood in a medium-sized indoor arena before the Hokage and the Jonin senseis waiting. Then a man appeared and looked at the Hokage, who just nodded, giving him permission to start. The man coughed, then said, "My name, is Hayate Gecko, and I will be our proctor for this part of the exam." Every single genin was thinking the same thing. Is he okay to be a proctor and his condiment? Hayate coughed, then said, "Now since there are too many candidates as of right now, we will be having a preliminary tournament to weed out the weakest links, which will begin right now." Hayate looked at them all, then sighed. But if there is anyone who is not feeling up to it, please speak up now." At this, a kid with glasses and grayish hair in a ponytail raised his hand and said, "I quit, this is too much for me." Hayate nodded and said, "Okay, Kabuto, wasn't it? Your Jonin will escort you out." Turning back to the rest of the kids, Hayate said, "The preliminaries will begin now, will everyone head to the balconies and you will be called down when it's your turn to fight." And with that all the genin went to the balconies. Then a screen behind where the Hokage was sitting began switching through names rapidly. When it stopped, two names were on it: Zaku and Shino. Naruto watched Zaku's and Shino's match with boredom. The matches he really wanted to see were Neji's and Gaara's, and although he wouldn't admit it to himself, he also wanted to see that Tenten girls match. And so Shino beat Zaku, and next Dosu beat Masumi. Kabuto's teammate Shikamaru beat Kin, which Naruto is when Naruto realized just how smart Shikamaru was. Then Kankuro beat Yoroi with his puppet. After a long wait on Naruto's part, there was finally a match he wanted to see: Gaara vs Lee. Naruto had to admit that he did take Lee by surprise when he knocked him out, and that Lee was a good ninja. The match had begun and Naruto noticed how Gaara's gourd contained sand, which moved on its own accord to protect him from any attack. But Naruto had already figured out the sand's weakness: water. If he soaked the sand, it would be too heavy to move fast enough, and Naruto could easily beat Gaara with taijutsu. Then Naruto noticed that Lee was standing on a statue and had just dropped some weights that were on his legs. But what surprised Naruto was when the weights hit the ground, they each made craters 5 feet in diameter. And now Lee was moving so fast Naruto could barely keep up. His speed surpasses mine by far, Naruto thought, and he was even landing most of his punches. And then Lee kicked Gaara up into the air, appeared behind him, wrapped the bandages on his arm around Gaara. And they both started spinning and falling to the ground at high speeds. When they hit the ground, Gaara turned into a sand clone, and then the real Gaara appeared. And Lee looked like he could barely move and was in pain. Lee got hit by Gaara's sand multiple times. Then finally Lee had had enough, and everyone in the arena heard Lee say, "Gai-sensei, please let this work." Then Lee started to turn red and veins appeared on his forehead, and finally chakra started to pour out of Lee's body. He's opening the inner gates, Naruto thought, recalling reading about them. Once Lee had opened 5 of the inner gates, he started to attack. His speed was so great that he was just a blur to everyone in the room. Then Lee performed the hidden lotus on Gaara, but Gaara's landing was cushioned by the sand. And Lee's muscles were now torn to shreds. The match Naruto thought was one of the greatest he'd ever seen finally ended when Gaara crushed both Lee's left arm and leg and Guy interfered. Lee had to be taken off the arena by a stretcher. Next up was Sakura and Ino, who both ended up knocking each other out. Then Tenten and Temari of the sand fought, and Tenten won by transforming a kunai into herself and having her real body sneak up behind Temari and stab her in the back with 2 kunai. Then Neji beat Hinata using the Hyuga-style taijutsu called Juken. And Sasuke easily beat Choji. Now the only people left were himself and Kiba, his childhood friend. Hayate looked up at the screen then said, "Will Naruto Uzumaki and Kiba Inuzuka please come down to the arena?" Faster than anyone but Sasuke and Sakura had seen him, Naruto was next to Hayate in the blink of an eye. This didn't go unnoticed by Kakashi and the Hokage, who both narrowed their eyes. Once Kiba was standing about 5 feet away from Naruto with Akamaru on his shoulder. Hayate looked at both of them and said, "Begin." Kiba looked at Naruto and said, "Why don't you just quit now? You know you're going to lose." Naruto smirked at that and said, "We'll see about that," then disappeared and reappeared so fast Kiba didn't have time to move as Naruto's fist slammed into his face. Kiba clutched his face with his hands and groaned, only to have Naruto's knee drive into his gut, making him cough up some blood. Naruto waited for Kiba to recover. He didn't want this to end too quickly. After all, this was fun. Akamaru whined, and after a moment Kiba said, "It's all right Akamaru, I'm fine," as he looked at Naruto. Naruto smirked again and said, "Ready for more?" And Naruto made a single hand seal, and all of a sudden there were 50 Narutos. Kiba looked around at the army that had now surrounded him and said, solid clones, not bad Naruto, but not good enough." Kiba then threw Akamaru a pill and he started to grow and his fur changed from white to red. "Let's go Akamaru, beast mimicry, man beast clone," and with that Akamaru transformed into another Kiba. The original Kiba went on all fours. The clone Kiba hopped on the original's back. Naruto chose this time to have his clones attack and gave the signal for his clones to attack. The Naruto clones ran at Kiba 5 at a time, only to be slaughtered by Kiba's now sharp nails and ferocious attacks. But when Kiba went after the last clone, Naruto made a hand sign, and right when Kiba was about to destroy the clone, it exploded, sending Kiba flying back 20 feet. Kiba coughed up some blood, stood up and looked at Naruto who said, "Kiba, you should know that I'm just toying with you." Kiba snarled and said, "Well, get serious, Atsuga," and both Kibas jumped at Naruto and started spinning at high speeds, forming two mini tornado-like blurs. Naruto used his speed to jump into the air, evading the attack. This continued until Naruto got rid of it, and when Kiba landed said, "Time to end it." Then using his superior speed appeared underneath Kiba, kicked him in the jaw, and sent him flying into the air at the height of the balcony. While Kiba was still in the air, Naruto quickly went through some hand signs, then inhaled and said, "Wind style, air bullet," and sent a blast of compressed air at Kiba which went at its mark X. Plotted, and Kiba fell and hit the ground with cuts and blood covering him. Hayate walked over to Kiba and after confirming he was unconscious said, "Winner, Naruto Uzumaki." End chapter. All the genin who knew Naruto in the arena just stared at him, all thinking the same thing: how the hell can Naruto do that? The Hokage looked back at Kakashi who was staring at Naruto with his visible eye wide, answering the Hokage's unspoken question. The Hokage looked back at Naruto and thought, if Kakashi didn't teach him that, how the hell did he learn it? Just then Hayate pulled out a piece of paper and pencil and started to write something. Then when he finished he said, "Will Shino, Dosu, Shikamaru, Kankuro, Gaara, Tenten, Neji, Sasuke, and Naruto please follow me?" The 9 contestants followed Hayate into another room. When they were all in the room, Hayate looked them over then said, "Congratulations, you've all made it to the final rounds, which will be held in 1 month, you will be informed of your opponents within the week." And with that Hayate left in a swirl of leaves, leaving the 9 finalists by themselves glaring at each other. Sasuke, Neji, Shikamaru, and Tenten were all looking at Naruto who just stared back. Sasuke was the first to speak as he said, "Naruto, where did you learn all that?" Naruto looked at Sasuke with a blank expression and said, "None of your business, Tem." Sasuke growled and said, "It doesn't matter. You can't defeat me anyway." By now everyone was listening Naruto and Sasuke's conversation, and Naruto said, "We'll see about that, Tem." Gaara looked at Naruto and said, "I will kill you to prove my existence, and to make mother happy." At this Naruto stared at Gaara and then said, "You can try, but you will not succeed." Gaara smirked and walked away, followed by Kankuro. And soon after everyone went their separate ways. Gaara walked up to his sensei Baki and Temari with Kankuro behind him. None of them exchanged any words, but instead just walked up to their temporary apartment. When got there they walked in and closed the door, then Baki said, "Temari, because of your loss you will have to somehow sneak into the stands, and join Gaara, Kankuro, and myself for the start of the invasion." Temari lowered her head and said, "Understood," and walked out the door. Baki looked back at his 2 other students and said, "I think the only ones that you might have to worry about are that Naruto kid. As well as Neji Hyuga and Sasuke Uchiha." Kankuro smirked and said, "Well, it doesn't matter, they'll all be dead soon anyway." Baki frowned at this and said, "Maybe not if Gaara gets injured. And I know you're going to say it's impossible, but it just happened not even 3 hours ago." Kankuro sighed and said, "I guess you're right," but Kankuro stopped when Gaara walked out of the room and both Baki and Kankuro looked at each other, each knew what the other was thinking. "We better keep an eye on him," and they both started following him. Kabuto walked through the forest outside of Konoha, looking behind him periodically. After a few minutes he stopped at a small clearing and a man wearing the robes of the 4th Kazekage stepped out from behind a tree. Kabuto looked at the man and smirked, then said, "You can take off the disguise, Orochimaru-sama." Orochimaru chuckled and said, "How very perceptive of you, Kabuto, and how are our plans coming along?" Kabuto smir. Kedon said, "The fools don't suspect a thing, and preparations are somming along smoothly." Orochimaru smiled and said, "The sand must be getting overconfident if they haven't realized that their precious Kakekage is dead." Orochimaru frowned when Kabuto looked off into the distance, then said, "Kabuto, is there something you wish to tell me?" Kabuto looked at his master and said, "I did as you said and kept an eye on the Uchiha's team." But Orochimaru Naruto his eyes and said, "But what?" At that moment Kabuto sighed and then looked Orochimaru in the eye, then said, "It seems the information I have on the demon child Naruto Uzumaki's abilities are dreadfully wrong." Orochimaru stared at Kabuto then said, "Do explain." Kabuto nodded and said, "It appears that not just my own but everyone in T. He Leaf Village's information on Naruto's abilities have been dreadfully wrong. He was supposedly the worst of the rookie 9 and dead last in the academy." Kabuto paused then continued, "But in the rest of death and during the preliminaries he showed exceptional talent and ability matching that of even Sasuke Uchiha." Orochimaru's eyes widened in surprise and he said, "That is interesting indeed, I'll anyway continue to keep an eye on the Uchiha." Kabuto nodded and disappeared, leaving Orochimaru to mull things over. Naruto walked down the street with his hands in his pockets. It had been 4 days since the end of the preliminaries. "I wonder who I'll be facing in the finals." But Naruto was cut off from his thoughts when an Anbu appeared in front of him and said, "Naruto Uzumaki, the Hokage wishes to speak with you." Naruto just nodded and they headed off towards the Hokage tower at a fast pace. The Anbu glanced at Naruto and thought, I can't believe this kid can keep up with me," then looked back ahead. Naruto and the Anbu appeared in the Hokage's room minutes later, and Naruto noticed not just the old man but Kakashi, and a tall man with long white spiky hair that he did not know. Hiruzen looked at the Anbu and said, "Leave us," in a commanding tone. Naruto, knowing what this was about, said, "I assume this is about my performance at the preliminaries." Hiruzen nodded and said, "That. And one other thing which I will get to later." Hiruzen looked down at a piece of paper and then back at Naruto and said, "It has come to my attention that you used some very high-ranking jutsu in the Forest of Death and during the preliminaries, and there have been no records of using them prior to the exams." Naruto smirked and said, "Let me put it to you frankly, Hokage-sama, ever since you scolded me for writing on the Fourth's monument everything you've seen of me has been fake and I have trained and trained to get as strong as I am now." Naruto paused then said, "All in all the little prankster you once knew is gone." Hiruzen frowned at Naruto and said, "I can assume then that you have not shown us all your abilities yet." Naruto nodded and said, "You haven't seen anything yet." The looked at the man with white hair and continued on saying, "Who's this guy?" Hiruzen glanced at Jiraiya who said, "Hey kid, name's Jiraiya of the Sannin, nice to meet ya." Naruto's eyes widened and he said, "Sannin huh? And you're a seal master right, can you help me control the nine-tailed fox's power?" Everyone's but Naruto's eyes widened, for as far as they knew the kid knew nothing about the nine-tailed fox being sealed within him. Kakashi was the first to speak. "Naruto, how did you know about the nine-tailed fox?" Naruto just grinned and said, "I figured it out, then thought, with a little help, thank God for Zabuza-sama." Jiraiya smirked and said to Naruto, "Hey kid, I'll teach you how to use the fox's chakra if you sign the toad summoning scroll. It's a double win," and finished with a thumbs up thinking, "I think Minato would want his only son to sign the toad scroll." Naruto put his hand to his chin in a thinking pose then said, "Okay, I'll do it." Hiruzen smiled and said, "Okay Naruto, you're dismissed." Naruto nodded and left without another word. Hiruzen waited a moment then said, "Jiraiya, keep an eye on him for me, will ya?" Jiraiya sighed and said, "So this is what the Sannin are reduced to, watching over kids." "Sure, I'll do it." Hiruzen smirked and said, "Of course you will, because it was an order." At this Kakashi took his leave, Jiraiya following soon after, and Hiruzen growled menacingly at the paperwork in front of him. Naruto walked down the street with hid hands in his pockets and thought, what to do, what to do. He was so deep in thought he hadn't realized that he was walking to his apartment until he was already at his front door. When Naruto looked up he said, might as well rest a bit," and with that said he opened his door, went into his room and laid down on his bed. Naruto looked up at the ceiling and thought, I wonder how Zabuza-sama is doing. Naruto's eyes widened and he said, what would Zabuza say if he saw me laying around when I would be training, and hopped out of bed. Naruto ran down the street with one thought in mind, head to Team 7's training ground. When he arrived he said, now what to do first, how about some stretches, and with that Naruto started stretching. Elsuer in Konoha, Tenten and Hinata were walking down the street talking, so Tenten, you're in the finals huh? Tenten nodded and said, yeah, I can't wait to find out who my opponent is. Hinata smiled and said, so you're confident that you'll win? Tenten frowned and said, I'm not so sure, I mean there are a lot powerful opponents I might have to face. Hinata nodded. The end said, I'm sure you'll, but stopped when she saw Sakura and Ino walking towards them in a serious conversation. When Sakura and Ino were right in front of them, Sakura turned to Hinata and said, Hina. I know this is kind of sudden, but when you watch Naruto, have you ever seen him use the kind of skill or jutsu like in the preliminaries? Hinata blushed since she had not known that anyone had seen her spy on Naruto. Then realized something and said, no, I haven't. It's kind of odd, isn't it? Sakura nodded and said, I know, even on missions with Kakashi-sensei he never showed any talent or skill. Ino looked at Tenten and said, hey Tenten, how about we go find Naruto and ask him, since you're in the finals and you might have to face him. Tenten thought about it for a minute then said, sure, why not? And Sakura smirked and said, in that case he's probably at our team's usual meeting spot in the training grounds, and knowing him he's training. With that said, the four girls headed off to find Naruto. Just like Sakura said, they found Naruto at Team 7's training grounds. But instead of asking him what they wanted to know, they decided to hide in the trees and watch him train. Naruto had just finished his warm-ups when he noticed four people watching him from the trees. Glacking in their direction faster than any of the four could detect, he saw Sakura, Ino, Hinata, and Tenten. Naruto blushed slightly and started to get nervous. He had recently realized that he liked Tenten more than a friend, and now she was watching him. Naruto's hormones tomb over and he thought, they want to spy on me, huh? Well, I'll give them something to see. And with that he took off his shirt, revealing his perfectly toned and muscular torso. Tenten just stared at Naruto's muscular torso and started to get turned on, then thought, damn, he's hot. Wait, what am I thinking? I could be facing him in the finals, but he's so hot. The three other girls were having similar thoughts, yes, even Sakura and Ino. Naruto smirked, noticing the girls' wide eyes, and then started his third most advanced taijutsu form. When Naruto finished he said, just wondering when you girls plan on coming out from behind those trees. All 4 grams. IRLs blushed and they thought, he knew we were here the whole time. Hinata was the first to move and jumped down in front of Naruto, followed by the other 3. Naruto looked at Sakura, Ino, Hinata, and Tenten in turn. But when his eyes fell on Tenten he noticed that she was looking away from him. Naruto smirked and said, hey Tenten, why are you looking away? Tenten looked at Naruto and said, well, isn't it obvious, you're ugly. Naruto smirked again and said, oh, is that why you're turned on? Knowing he was taking a chance by saying this. Success. Tenten turned beet red and said, I don't know what you're, but stopped when Naruto disappeared, then reappeared right behind her and snaked his arms around her waist. Naruto moved his lips to her ear and whispered, are you turned on yet? When Tenten heard him whisper in her ear, her heart started to beat much faster. She was definitely turned on. Naruto let go of her, then put on his shirt and walked away, leaving the 4 girls standing in shock. It had now been 6 days since the end of the preliminaries, and Naruto was walking down the street. He had just found out that he would face Sasuke in the first round, and was totally pumped. He had wanted to beat the snot out of the Uchiha for a while now. Naruto was brought out of his thoughts when that guy named Jiraiya appeared in front of him. Jiraiya smiled and said, hey kid, you ready for training? Naruto grinned widely. He had been waiting for this, then said, you bet, let's get started. Jiraiya nodded and started to walk to an unknown place, and Naruto followed close behind. The two stopped walking when they came to an open area with no one around. Jiraiya turned to Naruto and said, first I'm going to teach you the summoning jutsu. Naruto frowned and said, but I want to learn how to control the 9-tailed fox's chakra. Jiraiya nodded again then said, I know, but the summoning jutsu is an awesome technique. Naruto sighed then said, okay, fine. Jiraiya smiled then bit his thumb, drawing some blood, did some hand signs, and slammed his hand onto the ground. There was a puff of white smoke and after a moment it disappeared, revealing a toad a little larger than Jiraiya which held a scroll in its mouth. Jiraiya took the scroll from the toad's mouth which disappeared after, then turned to Naruto. Naruto waited patiently for Jiraiya to speak. Jiraiya put the scroll on the ground then opened it, revealing 2 names. Naruto looked at the names, the first one was Jiraiya, and the second one was none other than Minato, the fourth Hokage. Jiraiya looked at Naruto then said, Naruto Zhu. Sign your name in blood on one of the slots then stamp your fingerprints. Naruto nodded and bit his thumb, wrote his name, and stamped his fingerprints on the scroll. Naruto smiled and thought, awesome. I just signed a summoning scroll. Naruto stood in the center of a giant arena along with all the other finalists. He was perfectly calm, probably because he knew no one here was on his level. One thing was bugging him though. Where was that guy named Dosu? Must have dropped out, he thought. Their proctor for the finals Shiranui Genma pulled out a piece of paper, opened it, and showed to the finalists. There has been a slight change in the matchups, so look here to see who you will face. Naruto looked at the paper and saw that he was still facing Sasuke in the first round then looked away. That was all he needed to know right now. After a minute Genma put the paper back in his pocket and said, will everyone but Naruto and Sasuke head up to the finalist stands? Once everyone was out of the arena but Naruto, Sasuke. Genma looked at them both and said, are both of you ready? They both nodded so Genma said, begin. Sasuke smirked and said, even though you showed some new tricks I end the preliminaries you still have no chance of beating me, and whoever taught you those jutsu must be even more stupid than you thinking that it could help you beat me. After hearing the last part, rage filled Naruto and he snarled saying, I originally was going to just make you quit the match after I beat you bad enough, but now I'm going to destroy you. Sasuke didn't have time to respond as Naruto appeared in front of him, punching him in the gut, and sending him flying into the wall of the stadium. Sasuke coughed up some blood and activated his Sharingan. I'm going to need it if I want to keep up with his speed, he thought. Sasuke charged at Naruto and aimed a punch at his head, which Naruto sidestepped and retaliated with a kick to the side. Sasuke jumped in the air dodging the ki. CK to his side then brought an axe kick down on Naruto's head. Naruto saw the axe kick coming and grabbed Sasuke's foot stopping the kick and then threw him across the stadium. When Sasuke got up he charged at Naruto one more time. Only Naruto was ready. Naruto rapidly went through some hand signs then when Sasuke was 5 feet in front of him he put his hands out in front of him and said, wind style, great breakthrough jutsu. A powerful blast of wind slammed into Sasuke's chest breaking 2 ribs and sent him flying into the wall again. After a few seconds Sasuke got up blood trickling down the corner of his mouth. And a look of contorted rage on his face. Naruto smiled, crossed his fingers, and summoned 20 shadow clones which ran at Sasuke. Sasuke ran at the clones while going through some Han-D signs then said, fire style, dragon flame jutsu, and a stream of fire shot from his mouth destroying the clones. Once the clones were destroyed Sasuke went through some more hand signs and put his Ha-ND to mouth and said, fire style, fireball jutsu, and medium-sized fireball was sent towards Naruto. Naruto went through some hand signs again then said, water style, violent water wave, and a large blast of water was shot from Naruto's mouth extinguishing the fireball. But Naruto wasn't done and went through even more hand signs then said, water style, water dragon jutsu, and a water dragon formed out of nothing. Rushed forward at great speeds, and slammed into Sasuke's chest breaking 3 more ribs. Once again Sasuke was sent flying into the wall of the stadium, and Sasuke coughed up blood all over the ground. Naruto appeared in front of Sasuke, took out a kunai, and drove it into a Sasuke's gut ending the match as Sasuke fell to the ground unconscious. Genma pointed at Naruto and said, winner, Naruto Uzumaki. By the end of the match everyone who knew Naruto stared at him in shock, and those who didn't were either cheering or frowning because they had just lost their bets. Genma shed over to Sasuke and when he saw Sasuke's condition he immediately summoned a medical team to take him out of the arena. After Sasuke was taken out of the arena Naruto jumped up into the finalist stands and leaned against the railing waiting for the next match. Naruto glanced at his right and noticed the rest of the contestants looking at him. He frowned and said, are you guys going to say something or just keep staring at me? At this everyone looked back at the proctor waiting for the next match. They didn't have to wait long as Genma looked up at the contestants and said, will Tenten and Shino please come down to the arena? So we can start the next match. Tenten and Shino both jumped down into the arena and stood facing each other. Genma looked at each in turn then said, "Begin." After about 3 minutes the match was over with Tenten declared the winner. Shino just couldn't avoid the continuous barrage of weapons, and by the end he had 2 kunai in his left arm and a sword in his gut. Shino was rushed to the hospital and Tenten jumped back up to the other contestants. Genma looked back up at the contestants again and said, "Will Neji and Gaara please come down to the arena?" Neji jumped down into the arena and Gaara disappeared into sand and reappeared across from Neji. Genma eyed them both and then said, "Begin." Gaara made the first move as his sand rushed forward. Neji jumped to the side and threw some shuriken at Gaara whose sand blocked the projectiles. Neji then rushed forward and attempted to hit Gaara using his gentle fist fighting style, only to hit a wall of sand. He match content like this until Gaara sent a wave of sand at Neji who was forced to use his rotation jutsu, deflecting and repelling the sand. That's for today.